this may just be our largest post-COVID crowd, so give yourself a hand. My name is Jim Richmond. I'm on the program committee for Brookside Museum, and I'm just so pleased to see everybody here, and now I know why we kept the small wooden chairs. Because this is called the long room, but it's not as long as it could be in some cases when we have a great topic like this and a great speaker that we have with John Scherer. You were so quiet. We had this all planned, that because usually people are talking among themselves. Give it a shot anyway. This was to get your attention, but you didn't need it. Okay, that's enough.
Get those locks open.
So this is just a little bit of what you're going to get from John, I think, as we go through. I just wanted to mention one other program that we have this year coming up. That's on November 8th, when Paul Perot, who's the town historian for Malta, is going to do a talk on World War I, local soldiers of World War I. And that's actually in commemoration of the 105th anniversary of the Armistice Day, which was November 11th, will be November 11th, 2023. So that's our last evening program of the year, and we hope you're able to come and enjoy it. In the fall of every year, especially this year, we always have a membership drive, as you know. How many are members of okay. All right, well, we appreciated that. One of the things that has made Brookside Museum so successful in the last 2 or 3 years is our membership. We now have over 400 members, which is more than twice what we had at the time of COVID. So, and without the members that we have, we'd never be able to do the programs that we do. The exhibit, I hope you got a chance to take a look at the exhibit, or you come back on another day and see the Saratoga County exhibit that Field Horn put together over the last, well, he didn't put it together over the last 400 years, but it is about 400 years of history, so lucky Field's not here. So during these 2 or 3 years of our rejuvenation, we've really taken a county-wide approach in all our programs, and we've expanded our programs. In addition to the exhibits and our in-house programs, we have an expanded school programs that Ann Clothier, our education director, takes to schools throughout Saratoga County. And we've also added other items in the last couple of years, which some of you have participated in. For instance, our tours. We have historians' tours now, 5 or 6 in the good season of the year. And we also have initiated a new series of videos called Forgotten Crossroads. And we're working now on our third a Forgotten Crossroad, which is on Vischer Ferry, and Mr. Sherer is working with us on that as well. So there's a lot of activities going on, but our overall theme is to take a more county-wide approach, that we look into all the communities that we can throughout the county, okay, so that everybody knows about, well, Ballston Spa, but Saratoga especially, Clifton Park, the Northway, but we intend to, in our programs, reach to all corners of the county. So, and we can do that with your help. So if you are a member or you have renewed your membership, thank you. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to become a member, you can certainly do that either tonight or online on our website, brooksidemuseum.com, for the next year, for 2024. So again, enough of me. I really appreciate you being here tonight, and I'm looking forward to this program. Tonight, I'd like to welcome John Scherer. He's served as a Clifton Park town historian. I was going to say for longer than I've been alive, but that wouldn't be true. No. So, but it's been for 45 years. And he has been, I think you've been interested in the Erie Canal since the day you arrived or before.
You have to realize I was really young when I got involved.
Really young, yeah.
12.
Yeah. Oh, 12? I was going to say 2 or something, but yeah, right. In his day job, John was curator of the Decorative Arts program at the New York State Museum from 1967 to 2009, and currently serves as senior historian emeritus there. Since becoming town historian, John has written 5 books. Hasn't gone up since last month, right? Okay. On Clifton Park history, and was instrumental and setting up an historic preservation commission for the town. And as I mentioned before, he's now working with the History Center and a group of Vischer Ferry citizens to develop our next Forgotten Crossroads video, which should be out, fingers crossed, in March of 2024, or maybe April. So anyway, without further talking from me, I'd like to welcome John Scherer.
Thank you, Jim. And I bring you greetings from the southernmost town in Saratoga County. And it looks like there's a lot of interest in the Erie Canal, which we'll be celebrating its bicentennial in 2025, bicentennial of its official opening. This was a big deal, the Erie Canal. It was an engineering wonder. It was considered the eighth wonder of the world when it opened. It was an artificial river that connected the Hudson River with Lake Erie. And it went 365 miles. Not only was it headed west, but you were going uphill. So they had to design a system of locks so that when you head west, you go uphill. Coming down, you're lowered as you head east. They had to cross rivers and streams. They had to build aqueducts. These were bridges that actually held water. The canal went over the rivers and the streams. It was an amazing feat, and it was because of the Erie Canal that RPI opened in 1824, the engineering school. So they were working on it. Well, they began digging it in 1817. We did have some celebrations to acknowledge the beginning of the Erie Canal. They started out in Rome, New York, digging it. But the opening was an amazing feat. DeWitt Clinton, who was governor of the state at that time and was one of the major supporters of the Erie Canal, creating the Erie Canal, began a trip on Lake Erie to open the canal. And he was on board a ship called the Seneca Chief. And I just heard that the Seneca Chief has been replicated and will be used during the bicentennial of the canal, which is exciting news for me. Brian Stratton here, who's involved with the Canal Corps, had mentioned that to me. And so this is wonderful. But as the governor began his trip from the Erie Canal, he entered the canal from Lake Erie, and he had a keg that they filled with Lake Erie water on board the Seneca Chief. And he began his momentous journey into the canal, the first person to go through the Erie Canal. And they had cannon and relay all along the route, all along the canal and down the Hudson River, so that everybody along the route would know that the governor had entered the canal. All of the hamlets and villages that he passed on the canal had celebrations, parades, fireworks. This was a big deal. When they got to New York City, they had the biggest celebration of all, huge parades and fireworks, and they emptied that keg of Lake Erie water into New York Harbor in a ceremony called the Wedding of the Waters, and the harbor's been polluted ever since. So there were all sorts of souvenirs that were made. There was a publication that was done with lithographs of different things. It was quite an event. This is the thing I need right here. So here's that keg. That's the very keg that was used by DeWitt Clinton. It held the water from Lake Erie. As I say, I worked at the State Museum for many years, and we borrowed this for our canal exhibit. It was on exhibit there, so I could not resist having a colleague of mine take a photograph of me holding it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a trip on the canal, and we're going to go through Saratoga County on the canal and look at it. The canal was a tremendous success when it opened. So successful that they needed to enlarge the canal, and they started to enlarge the canal in 1836. They finished enlarging it in 1856. Through our area, this happened in 1841 and 42. So the original canal was only 4 feet deep and 24 feet wide across the top. The enlarged canal was 7 feet deep and 70 feet across the top. And as you all know, the boats were pulled by mules or horses, and they pulled it on the towpath. So they were hooked to the barge with the rope. So here is the junction of the Mohawk and Hudson rivers. And the canal actually started in Albany. The basin was in Albany. And then it came up through Waterford. And then when there were 2 locks there, and then it proceeded around Cohoes, around the Cohoes Falls. So initially, the Champlain Canal opened a year earlier, before the Erie Canal opened, and they're celebrating their bicentennial. So this is the junction of the Erie and the Champlain Canal at Waterford. So this is where the Erie Canal, or the Champlain Canal began, and of course it went up to Lake Champlain and eventually up to Canada. And this was the junction. This is the Champlain Canal today in Waterford. Later on, the barge canal came through and bisected it. So that's what you see in the distance. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So here's the Cohoes Falls. This was quite an interesting natural wonder that people would visit at the time. In fact, there was a hotel right there by the falls. And if you haven't seen the falls, they have a wonderful overlook there now in Cohoes. And you can visit it. It's really something to see after a rainstorm or after the ice melts. It really comes barreling over that. So in order to get around the Cohoes Falls, they had to build 16 locks. Yes, 16 locks. They were called the Terrible 16s. And it would take them a full day to go through those locks. And it was the reason for our nation's first railroad. In 1831, the train went from Albany to Schenectady. And people traveling on the canal, it would save them a whole day of traveling through those 16 locks, because they could come up the Hudson River. They could then disembark, take the train to Schenectady in an hour or 2. They'd be in Schenectady, and they could board the canal boats there to head west. So here's a picture of the canal coming up through Cohoes, and here's another picture of it going through Cohoes. And you can hike. There's a trail there now. You can actually hike along the towpath through Cohoes. And there's a wonderful bike path that hooks up to it as well. And you can go practically across the whole state on that. So this is lock 18. So this is the top of the 16s. This would be the last lock that you go through. And it's there, and you can visit it. There's a parking area to go over and look at the Cohoes Falls. The overlook, the parking area is right by the remains of Lock 18. So, if you're interested in taking a look at one of the locks, there it is. And most of the remains I'm showing you are from the enlarged canal from about 1842. So here we are. We're going to proceed west along the canal. We're coming up from Cohoes now. We've been through Lock 18. The mountain in the back, today we know it as Mount Trashmore. That's the colony dump. And it's grown considerably since this picture was taken. But here you can see it's being pulled by these 3 mules. The guy who would herd the mules, who would walk the mules, was called a hoji. And he would take care of the horses. And you can see these two boats are in tow. So many canal boats had a stable in the bow. So you would have 3 mules on for 6 hours, and then you would change them. So you'd take the mules from the stable in the front of the boat and take them off and put the other ones in to rest. You didn't have to have mules on your boat, though, because there were station barns along the way where you could rent mules, and you could work them for a while, six hours usually, and turn them in at another station barn and get fresh mules. But a lot of people carried the mules on board, and then the cabin that was in the back of the canal boat were the living quarters, and they were very small. So here we have to cross the Mohawk River, and we cross it on this aqueduct. This was the largest aqueduct in the Erie Canal system. It was completed, this is the 1842 enlarged canal, and it had 26 arches and was 1,160 feet long. Now, you can tell this is the upriver side of the aqueduct because those step-like things were used to break up the ice in the winter. And the earlier aqueduct was to the other side of this. And what they did was they used the abutments of the 1825 aqueduct for a bridge, a toll bridge. They built a toll bridge on it for vehicular traffic. So that was right next to it. So Crescent, the canal brought business to all of these little communities that it passed through. It was the reason for Syracuse and Utica and all these major cities along the canal, Rochester, because industrial goods could now be shipped on the canal. You know, they could ship these industrial goods out to the Great Lakes and to the farmers out in the Midwest. And the farmers could ship their produce to the industrial East via the canal. So, and settlers from New England used the canal to travel west to the Midwest. Many of those settlers came to Clifton Park as well. So anyway, here's a map. This is from the 1866 Beers Atlas. And you can see the aqueduct as it crosses the Mohawk River, and it sort of takes a turn and then follows the river on the north side of the river. And you can actually drive your car in this today. That's Canal Road. There's a little park there by the Route 9 bridge, Crescent Park, and it's right there along Canal Road. You have to go onto Canal Road to get to the park, and it goes further. And a brickwork started up here, a lot of stores, etc., things that support the canal. You can see there was a Drydock here as well. Alfred Noxon had the hotel. You can see the hotel there at the corner. So our next point is we head east. You notice there's no lock now. We've gone through Lock 18 in Cohoes, and now it's a level area. No locks for a while until we get to Vischer Ferry. That's the next lock. So, but we come into this canal side community called Clute's Drydock. Nicholas Clute came here in 1852. It was a dry dock before he came there, though. He was one of the last people to operate the dry dock, so it's now called Clute's Drydock, but initially the Vulvadire family operated it in 1825 and the earlier years. But today we know it as Clute's Drydock. And here's the gates to the dry dock here. Now, when you came to a populated area, you'd find stone lining the walls of the canal. Otherwise, they were earthen. And so the speed limit on the canal was 4 miles an hour, because if you went faster, it would wash away the banks. So here's a populated area, so we have the stonework. This is the store, Nicholas Clute's store right here. And you can see there was a number of houses along here at Clute's Drydock. And so what would happen, I'll show you here. This is the inside of the drydock. See, these are the cradles. So what happens is you're in the canal. If the bottom of a boat needed to be repaired, the gates would open. You'd pull the boat in and place it over one of these cradles. They would close the gates. The water would be drained out of the drydock, and then they could work on the bottoms of the boat. Or they could build a boat in the drydock. So here we have a boat in the drydock, and these two empty cradles fill it. And you can see the gates are closed right now. So after they got through working on it, water would be brought into the drydock, the gates would be opened, and back out into the canal you'd go. And you can visit it today. It's still there. And this is what it looks like today. This is now in the Vischer Ferry Nature and Historic Preserve, 600 acres, which is all on the National Register of Historic Places. And there is now an entrance to the preserve from Clute's Drydock. There's a parking area, so you can go in at that point. We made a sort of a kayak and canoe launch here by putting in this dock. There's the gates. It goes out into the canal. And if you take a left, you can go out into the Mohawk River. There's a break in the canal, and you can go out into the Mohawk River. This is kind of a nice feature for people to use, and it's especially nice this time of year or early in the spring before the water chestnuts get in there. But don't go this week because the preserve is open for duck hunting. Okay, so here's old Nicholas Clute out in his cutter in front of his house. And you can see a part of his barn here. And here's another picture showing practically the same view. This is a corner of his house. Here's the barn. And do you see this bridge? That's a farmer's bridge, because what they did when they dug the canal, they separated farmland. And they had to provide a bridge for these farmers so they could access their farmland. And these bridges were made of wood. And of course, the state being cheap then as much as it is today, they only made them as high as they needed to clear, the boats to clear. And that's where the expression, low bridge, everybody down, comes from, because people in the packet boat era, when they were traveling on packet boats, they would sit on top of the roof for fresh air and to see the scenery. They'd only go below for their meals and to sleep. So if you were on top of the canal boat, you came to a bridge, boy, if you didn't get off of that, off the top, you'd be wiped off. And in fact, I interviewed a lot of people back in the 70s who actually remembered the canal. One of these guys was a 90-year-old gentleman, Willard Ben Franken, and his grandfather lived right on the canal. And as a kid, he said they used to wait on the bridges for a passing canal boat, and they would jump onto the boat and ride it on down to the next bridge. So there was a schoolhouse at Clute's Drydock, a one-room schoolhouse, but there was also an ice house, and you can see it in back of the schoolhouse, an ice house, because ice harvesting was a big deal then. The conveyor belt would take the blocks of ice up, and it would be stored in the ice house in sawdust to keep it cold. And then, of course, these are in the days when people didn't have refrigerators. They had ice boxes. So they cut ice on the river, and here's another one. On the south side of the river, they would load it onto the train, which is now a bike path. Okay, so here's an 1851 map of the area we're talking about. And you can see the Erie Canal. Here's Clute's Drydock, okay? This line is the canal. You can see how it wanders through Clifton Park. So whereabouts are we? This is the village of Vischer Ferry here, okay? And this is Ferry Drive. This is the Stony Creek. And so it comes right along, parallels the river here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be traveling along here. So This is the way it looks today. This is the towpath in the Vischer Ferry Nature and Historic Preserve. And this is actually the towpath, and you walk on it. The canal is there to the left. A lot of stuff grown up in there. In some areas, there's actually water in the canal, so you can see it. So at the main entrance of the preserve, which is on Riverview Road, we have this Whipple Truss Bridge. So, and it's over the canal. So originally there was a bridge here. The abutments were down below grade, but the abutments were there. So interesting, Frank Griggs, who was a professor at Union College, found this canal bridge over the Cohoes Creek in Fonda. It originally was over the canal at Fultonville, and when the canal closed in 1917 because of the opening of the barge canal, that bridge was acquired by these farmers and put over the creek, so they had access to both sides of their property. Well, he recognized it as being a Whipple Truss Bridge, which is the type of bridge that was used all along the canal. The iron bridges were more or less public bridges. The farmers' bridges were made of wood. And he was interested in this bridge, and he offered to build him a new one if he would donate the old bridge to Union College. So that's what happened. They built the new bridge, and they dismantled this bridge and brought it to Union College, and he had his students restore it. Well, Union College already had a Whipple Truss Bridge on site, and so they were looking for a place to put this. Well, fortunately, we knew Frank, and we had the perfect place for it. So it was moved here over the canal, where there was originally a public bridge. In fact, that road was originally called the Public Bridge Road. And what we had to do is we had to build up the abutments because we were able to acquire pieces of the old Rexford Aqueduct to do that. And we had to make it higher than it actually was originally because of the floodplain. So it floods here because of the barge canal. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. So anyway, and this is dated right on at 1869, S. Whipple. So why was Union College so interested in this? Well, Squire Whipple was a Union College graduate, and it was his design of these bridges, these Whipple Truss bridges, arch truss bridges, that were used all along the canal. So you get to cross it if you come and visit. This is the way the canal looks today in the preserve. You'll pass something like this. This is a garage, but it was originally a canal side store. There wasn't an awful lot of room on the boat, so people had to stop frequently to replenish their food and other supplies. You'll pass this house as we go down. John Clute built this house in 1832. It has the date in this lintel stone right over the door. And this was the focal point of a little canal side settlement called Willow Spring. There was a spring under a willow tree, needless to say, and this could be used to replenish canalers' water supply. There was a station barn here and a store, a canal store. So you can see populated area, so we have stone lining the banks of the canal. Today there's a development. It's interesting because the front of this house faces the canal. The back faces Riverview Road, but the canal was the main thoroughfare at this time. And it also served as an inn for canalers. They could get something to eat here. They could spend the night here. Further on down, we pass this house. This is a very early house right on the banks of the canal. This was owned by the Van Vranken family. It's gone now. But I have an interesting story about it from one of the people that I interviewed. This was, again, an interview I did with Willard Van Vranken, and he would tell me about going to visit his grandfather here on the canal. And he would talk about the canal boats that went by the house, and he said at night, the sky would be lit up like daylight when the canal boats went by because they had these lanterns in the bow of the boat with reflectors, and they usually put the number of lanterns in the bow would indicate the number of boats in tour. I brought one of those lanterns, which is out there by the table. You can take a look at it later. But the other story he said was, for some reason, the tramps, the hobos, traveled on the towpath. And he said they would always stop at his grandparents' house because his grandmother would feed them. And they couldn't figure out how they knew that. Well, evidently they had marked the bridge just before the house, indicating that this was a good place to get a meal. So his grandfather found that out and made him earn the meal. He put him to work in the wood pile. So and now we've reached Lock 19. This is Lock 19 on the enlarged Erie. Originally it was Lock 32 on the 1825 ditch. And this is the way it looks today. And you can as I walk down the towpath about 1.4 miles and visit the lock. And they've got a bridge over it now so that you can see the other chamber. So these locks were two chambers. They're double chamber locks, so that they could lock two boats through at the same time. They could even lock boats going in the different directions at the same time. So this picture down below was taken later, 1907, and that's that's a pleasure boat going through Lock 7. But we're looking at it as we look west. And here's looking again the same direction. We're below the lock. There's the lock tender's shanty that you can see. And here now we're looking east. So we're above the lock, and we're looking east. And the way it looked about 1900 and the way it looks today, you can see the recess where the wooden gates went into the lock. And here they are. They're waiting for the boat to come through. And we're going to blow my horn. They're going to get those locks open so we don't have to wait. Well, in 1855, there were 350 boats a day that went through this lock. And so as you approach the lock on either side, it's wider. The canal widens out. They're called the wide waters. And so boats would have to wait their turn to get into the lock. And some canalers are pretty impatient, and they would get into fistfights to see who would go into the lock first. And in fact, some canalers had professional fighters on board, or at least people who really knew how to fight on board, so they'd have the upper edge. In fact, prize fighters got their start on the Erie Canal. John L. Sullivan, who was a well-known prize fighter, got his start on the Erie Canal. So the Justice of the Peace was not too far from the lock. He was right up on Riverview Road. And we have those records, the Justice of the Peace records for the 1850s and 60s, and they're just full of these incidents that's happening down at the lock. And they give fictitious names, John Smith, Joe Doe, And there was one case where one poor loser, as the canal boat was going into the lock, they lassoed the lumber and pulled it off the boat as it was going into the lock. Anyway, they're really interesting to read, these things. But they were a rowdy group. So this is the canal store and the lock tender's house here at Lock 19. So this young man sitting in the middle in the door, that's John Wooden, and he was the last lock tender at Lock 19, and his father was a lock tender before him, and his grandfather also worked on the canal. And I got a chance to interview John back in 1975, and he told me, his grandfather told him, when you walked down the main street in Vischer Ferry, all you could hear was the clanging of hammers, because there were two dry docks in Vischer Ferry where the canal boats were built and repaired. And many of the homes built in Vischer Ferry were built by the people who worked at those dry docks. They were ship's carpenters, sometimes called boat builders in the census records. So anyway, John had a lot of interesting stories. He also operated the ferry at Vischer Ferry for a while. Interesting story. As I say, I interviewed him in 1975. Then, 1996 maybe, I got a call from somebody in Niskayuna. Their neighbor wanted to talk to me, and I said, well, fine, have her give me a call. Well, she's stone deaf. She can't hear. So I said, oh, fine, I'll go and visit her. So I visit her, not knowing who she was. Turns out to be John Wooden's widow. She was like 95. And when John Wooden left to go to college in 1910, he was the operator of the lock and the ferry, and they gave him a big send-off, and they gave him a gold pocket watch. And she had it, and she wanted to give it back to the people of Vischer Ferry. So we now have that in our history collection. So let's visit Vischer Ferry while we're here, see what's there. This is a map, 1866. Here's the canal down here. This is Ferry Drive. Matthew Winnie owned the old Vischer homestead, and there was a dry dock here. And there was a dry dock here owned by the Hegeman family. So 2 dry docks on either side of the Stony Creek. We placed Vischer Ferry on the National Register in 1975. It's now a historic district, and we included the area that became the Vischer Ferry Nature and Historic Preserve in 1977. So there's 600 acres in the preserve, plus the hamlet of Vischer Ferry, that are on the National Register. So here is the Vischer House, later on the home of Matthew Winnie, who operated the dry dock. The Amity Church was built in 1888. These are some of the places that we'll see. This was the home of the Hegemans, who operated the other dry dock. This is the way it was on its original location. Somebody saw it in 1920 and didn't like the location. Can you imagine that? Anyway, they moved it to Loudonville, and the house now stands on Route 9 in Loudonville, not too far from where Crumity Road comes in. So Hegeman had a number of houses on Main Street to house, they were tenement houses for his dry dock workers. And this was one of them here. This is the way it looked in 1885. This is the way it looks today. It's still there. And one of the reasons that Vischer Ferry is on the National Register is because it's a typical upstate Erie Canal community with a high concentration of Greek Revival and Victorian architecture. And it was a working class hamlet. Most of the people who built these houses worked at the dry docks. This house is a little grander than most. This was built by a grandson or great-grandson of the original settler, Captain John Vischer. And he was an interesting guy. He had a racetrack on the road across the way. He used to race horses. And he and his wife had a fight, and they lived there in the house for years without ever speaking to one another. I tell people it must have been really peaceful. This house is a little Greek Revival house, and it was built by Shepherd Wheeler in 1844, and he's listed in the census records as a ship's carpenter and sometimes as a boat builder. And now we're going to leave Vischer Ferry behind. We're going away from Lock 19, headed west again. You can see it in the distance. And we're going to. This is Ferry Drive. We're going under the bridge that connects the river to Ferry Drive. Okay, so this boat is actually headed east. If you go to the end of Ferry Drive, you'll see the abutments for this bridge. They're still there. You'll also see the recess in the land for the dry dock that Winnie operated, Matthew Winnie. So that's what happened. You'd come down Ferry Drive, you'd cross the bridge, come down here, and then go down to the ferry. Oops, wrong way, Jose. Sometimes, during the winter months, they would drain the water from the canal so they could make repairs, and that's what's happening here. Also, at Vischer Ferry, the end of Ferry Drive, which this picture was taken, they would load the boats with molding sand. That was a major industry in Clifton Park. Beside agriculture, the mining of molding sand was the major industry all over the town, up until the 1960s, actually. So this molding sand would be loaded on the canal boats and shipped to the foundries, where it was used to create the molds to make cast iron, so like cast iron parlor stoves and things like that. In the northern part of the town, they loaded it on the railroad. And here's the ferry, which was established about 1790 by Eldred Vischer. But for a while, for 2 short years, we had a bridge, a toll bridge at Vischer Ferry. They've always wanted a bridge. Finally, they got one in 1900. You had to pay a toll to use it. And the first year, the ice did some damage to it, so they rebuilt it a little higher. The second year, it collapsed with the ice. The ice took it out. And there was a couple sparking on the bridge at the time. Sparking, that's an archaic word for making out. And they felt the bridge start to vibrate, and they immediately made it to the other side just in time to see the bridge fall into the river. This was all written up in the Schenectady Gazette at the time. And today, when they dredged the river, they came up with pieces of the bridge. It was never rebuilt, although they tried to rebuild it several times because the farmers wanted it rebuilt to get their produce to market in a timely fashion. And as late as 1938, there was a bill before the legislature to rebuild this bridge at Vischer Ferry. Those of us who live there are delighted that that never happened, because we would probably be living in Vischer Ferry estates rather than the old homes that we have. Here's just a painting by Len Tantillo. I worked with him in doing the research on what this might have looked like. This was the toll house to use the bridge. Of course, the bridge is gone here, but you can see the abutment. This is that canal bridge I showed you at the end of Ferry Drive. And you can see a boat in the canal here and on the way to the ferry. So the ferry went back into business and was in business up until about 1922. So we're headed west towards Rexford. We come to this point, and there's a lot of construction going on. This is in 1907 because they're starting to dam up the Mohawk River to make it navigable to create the barge canal. So that's what we're seeing here. They're building that dam at Lock 7 of the barge canal. Then we go to Lock 20. If you're familiar with the area, this is now at the end of Robinson Street. It's underwater. Again, because of the barge canal, it raised the water level, so the lock is underwater. What they did in the 1880s and 90s is they lengthened the north chamber of the locks on the Erie Canal system so that 2 boats in tow could get into the lock all at once. So this is what they're doing here. They're lengthening the north chamber of the double lock here, Lock 20. And you'll notice when you go to look at Lock 19, you'll see it's a different stonework. You can tell that it's been added to it. So here we are moving towards Rexford. This canal boat could maybe be filled with molding sand. Don't quite know. And we come to this canal bridge, which is at Fundy's Basin. A guy by his last name was Fonda, and it got corrupted to Fundy's Basin. And it's right where Mohawk Landing is today. In fact, there's a driveway that goes down to the site. Here we're almost at Rexford. You can see the cliffs, probably the cliffs from which Clifton Park takes its name. Clifton means place on a cliff. And you can see the towpath. It's the only thing that separates the canal from the river here. And here's a cave in the cliffs, which there's tradition that indicates that, dead canalers were buried here in this cave. And here we are on the bluffs above Rexford, looking down on the canal. Here's a towpath. This is Lock 21. Here's the feeder canal that brings the water into the canal. This is the aqueduct in the distance because we're going back across to the south side of the river. Why on earth did they pay all that money to bring the canal into Saratoga County? A lot of people wanted the business that would result from the canal. They lobbied for it to come here into Saratoga County. There were also other reasons. For example, the snow would melt faster on the north side because of the way the sun hits it, so it could open earlier in the spring. I can't imagine the digging was any easier here. As a matter of fact, wait a minute, where is it? Wrong way. So this was the deepest cut in the Erie Canal here. It's where the, well, this is a Lock 7 dam they're building, and above it is now the power station. And that was the deepest cut that they had to make along the whole canal. Okay, so now, again, and these locks are still there. They're in the Schenectady Yacht Club, and they have a crane over the south chamber of the lock, and they use that to take the boats out of the water in the winter. So there's a cut in the canal about here, so it goes out into the river now. So they bring their boats in, take them out here, put them back in the spring, again, using that crane. And now a lot of the boats, they have the boats docked over here, but they also have a lot of boats lined up in here as well. And here's Rexford. You can see the aqueduct going across the river. And here they are lengthening that north chamber, about 1890. And it's winter time, that they could do that in the winter. Towards the end of the life of the Erie Canal, it became a very nostalgic trip. You know, people talked about the old Erie, and people would go at Rexford, they'd go down to the locks and watch the boats go through. Excursion boats, I mean, these people are riding the boat. Pleasure boats would go through. This is all down at Lock 22 in Rexford. And this is the store of Michael Travis, which was built about 1902. Here it is. This is Lock 22. This is the last lock you go over before you go on to the aqueduct. So you had 21 and 22 pretty close together, and then you went across on the aqueduct. So this was the Travis store, and here it is today. It's now the headquarters of the Schenectady Yacht Club. So you'll see that as you cross the 146 bridge. And this was Cyrus Rexford's store, practically right across the canal, right across the canal from Travis's store. And this is the entrance on the road, which is now Route 146, but there was also a main entrance on the canal in the back. And you can see the toll road here, where you'd have to pay a toll to cross the bridge. And it was the same thing here. They built the bridge on the abutments of the earlier aqueduct. And this is what Rexford would have looked like at the time. You can see the Cornell blacksmith shop here, and this was Templar's Hall. And it's still pretty much, these buildings are still there. You have to take there's like a circle that goes off of 146 down into the old town of Rexford Flats. This was a really nice drawing of the aqueduct. You can see the vehicular bridge on the abutments of the old aqueduct right here. This is Rexford here, and you can see the bridge here, Canal Bridge at Rexford. I found this at the Round Lake Antique Show, and I saw it and I said, I have to have it. And it's signed up here by William Van Loan and dated 1883. I think that they would go around doing these bird's eye views of towns, but what they would do, people would have to subscribe to them first. So they would collect the money for them, and then they would make a lithograph out of the drawing. They would exhibit the drawing. People would, pay for the lithographs, then they would make the lithographs. And I think that's what this was for. But obviously, he didn't sell enough to make it worth his while. At any rate, the guy wanted like $1,500 for it, and I said, "Oh, can you do any better?" He came down to $1,200, and I said, "Well, I doubt that I'll get the town to pay for it, but I worked at the museum at the time, and I thought I could get a donor to buy it," which I did, so it's now in the New York State Museum. Wasn't going to let it go. Here's Cyrus was an important guy. You know, he was a politician. He was town supervisor at one time. And he built a very impressive house in the Victorian stick style that was popular at the time, 1883, at the top of the hill. And he operated the store and bought lots of land there in Rexford. So here's a wonderful picture of the aqueduct with a barge going through, and you can see the bridge next to it. And this is the McLean Hotel, which was a very popular watering spot for canalers. And we can date photographs by it because that wasn't built until 1897. So we know that this photograph is after 1897. And that came down when they put the bridge there. I'll talk about that in a minute. So here we are in the winter, and they're repairing the aqueduct at Rexford. You can see the timbers. It's 1894. Here's some other views of the Rexford Aqueduct. And there's lots of views of the Rexford Aqueduct. I guess it was quite a feature, particularly from the cliffs above. There's stereo views, there's postcard views. I think there's a postcard view out there that I have on the table of Rexford. So as I said, nostalgia started to kick in the early 1900s. And so they had these steamboats now on the canal. And this was an excursion boat from Schenectady. It was called the Kitty West. And you could take this for an excursion out to Vischer Ferry or Rexford or wherever. And a lot of people did this, and they would take a picnic lunch or something and have a picnic in Vischer Ferry. I've got pictures of people picnicking in Vischer Ferry, and they undoubtedly came out there on the Kitty West. In fact, this is at Clute's Drydock. I recognize Clute's store here. Interesting, it's all men. You see that? I think the women are home getting supper, maybe. Or maybe it's a men's group. I don't know. But that was the Kitty West was a popular excursion boat out of Schenectady. The entertainment on board was a music box that you'd crank up, and that music box is now at the Schenectady Historical Society. And we now have the lantern that was in the bow of the boat at the historic Groom's Tavern. So here we are now. This is the building of the dam at Lock 7. So they're now damming up the Mohawk and dredging it to make it navigable, and they want to move the canal into the river. So this was completed in our area in 1915. The barge canal opened in 1915. What they did was they moved the canal from Waterford, or from Cohoes over to Waterford, and the 16 locks were replaced by 5 locks over in Waterford. So now the canal goes up through Waterford rather than Cohoes. And you go into the river. So what that did was it raised the water level, and a lot of features went underwater, like the old towpath in Rexford under the cliffs. So here's the old Rexford Aqueduct in 1914, just before the barge canal opened. And you can see the ice took out the bridge, and not the aqueduct, just the bridge. And what happened was that to make the boats to be able to go on the river, they had to take out the center section of the aqueduct, and then they bridged it. And this was in 1914 they did this, because the barge canal opened, and you can see, here it is. See, they opened it up here, but you still had either end. And this is a good view, because you can see the trough. The trough was wood. This is what held the water. The arches supported the towpath. And so what was interesting is what they did, they opened this up so that the boats could go underneath it. And what they did was they made the towpath the road. Okay? So until 1964, when you crossed the river on Route 146, you were driving on the towpath of the aqueduct. It wasn't until '64 that was replaced. And then they put in a new bridge in '64. And of course, now we have even a newer bridge. It was replaced a couple of years ago. And that's when the McLean Hotel was torn down as well. It had been abandoned. It was deserted. Popular subject of artists. You'll find all sorts of paintings and watercolors of the McLean Hotel. And they left sections of the aqueduct intact on either side of the river, so you can actually see them. This is a New York State historic site, the remains of the aqueduct. And again, this was a trough that held the water, and the towpath was supported by the arch. And this is the Saratoga County side. On the other side, there's even more of the aqueduct left, and there's a little park. You can actually walk out on the aqueduct. It's kind of nice. And there's a lot of interpretive signage that has been added. Oh, I close with this because I didn't realize it until fairly late that my great-great-grandfather, Andrew Elliott, was a canal boat captain from Lockport. And I always wondered if I could ever find a picture of his boat, and I kept Googling Andrew Elliott and canal boat, and finally I found this picture. The Canal Society of Western New York had posted it on their Facebook page, and this is my great-grandfather and his parents and his younger brother. And his first boat he named the Andrew Elliott after himself. This boat he named Easton and Albert because Easton and Albert were his sons, and named them for his sons. And he was a canal boat captain from Lockport. You can see Lockport's written right here. And I think they're in Buffalo because they would load up with wheat, with grain. And later on, through the miracle of DNA and Ancestry.com, I discovered a cousin, a distant cousin, who lived out in Wisconsin. And I don't know how I contacted him. And his father had been interested in canal life. And he had interviewed George, the youngest son, who lived into the 1960s. And they wrote back and forth these letters about what it was like to be on the canal. And he sent me copies of the letters. It was wonderful. He's describing a trip on the canal. They load up with grain, and they're headed east. And he's describing crossing on an aqueduct and going along the towpath where the river's on one side and the canal's on the other. So he's talking about going through Vischer Ferry in Saratoga County. And then he talks about they end up in Troy, and they get on the tow. There's they tow the boats. They get a number of canal boats. They tow them to Albany, to the basin. And I guess there's maybe 20 boats on that tow. And then they get on a larger tow in Albany, maybe 100 boats. A steamboat tows them all down to New York Harbor. And he talks about being on the boat in New York Harbor, and they load up, they unload their grain, and they load up this clay that came from Bayonne, New Jersey. They load up with clay, and they go back to Rochester, and the clay is used to produce stoneware because Rochester was a large stone. All along the canal, you had these stoneware factories. Again, because of the canal, it could bring the clay that was necessary to make the stoneware and stop off at the canal. And that's how they sold their wares, too, is on the canal. In fact, the stoneware dealers had a postcard they'd send out to the store saying, "We will be in your area on such and such." Anyway, that was an interesting connection I thought was sort of interesting. So thank you for sitting through all of this, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. Yes?
What is the difference? You talk about the Barge Canal and the Erie Canal.
Yes.
Are they the same?
It's the Erie Barge Canal. So it's still the Erie Canal, but it's not the old Erie, which was in this hand-dug ditch. The Barge Canal went into the Mohawk River. And as you go further west, it's still the old canal, but they've sort of enlarged it some.
Why didn't they just call it the Erie Canal? They're heading out for Lake Erie. And
Maybe to differentiate from the old Erie. I mean, it's still called the Erie Canal, but it's the Erie Barge to differentiate it. Yes?
How did they feed water to that aqueduct in Crescent? It's 20 feet above the river.
How did they get
How
the?
do they feed the water to that aqueduct? The aqueduct is 20 or 30 feet above the river.
Well, it was.
How did they supply that water?
Well, the aqueduct was level with the canal, so you go up.
So that whole canal the whole Erie Canal was above the river. Correct.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, and of course at Rexford you had to go up to the aqueduct. That's why you had those two locks in Rexford, so you had to go up to the aqueduct. George.
Your water supply was further west and higher. The pictures at Rexford, where John pointed out the feeder canal, that little feeder canal fed the whole lower part of the Erie Canal because it was higher than the 1,000.
So that's why I questioned it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's
Water
where-
doesn't went over.
that's where.
Yeah, because you're going uphill.
All right.
Thanks.
In Saratoga County, did they ship lumber on the canal? Because this area was noted for...
Yeah, I'm sure they did. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Then the sources of the stone that was used in the stonework on the canal.
Well, it depends on what section of the canal you talk about. In our area, I think a lot of it came from Rotterdam Junction. And it's interesting, when you see the lock, they didn't use mortar. Everything just fits so tight.
I understand that where the Manhattan developments are in Clifton Park, that was some of that molding sand.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Every place in Clifton Park has that sand, practically. Yeah, it was mined all over. Yes.
What was the given sailing day, pulling day duration? Was it sunrise to sunset, or did they go 24 hours with lanterns?
I don't know.
I think they were 24 hours.
You think they went 24 hours?
They did.
I know it took took 7 days. Took 7 days.
6 hours.
Yes.
It's not a question, but it's a comment. I had the opportunity to go on the Erie Canal from Schenectady Yacht Club. I helped a friend. He needed a crew on his boat. It's a wooden boat that he has restored, and it is a replica of the Spray, which is Josh Slocum sailed around the world in. It's 54 feet long, so he needed hands to go through all of those canals, and it is absolutely fascinating. And I learned about that the Schenectady Yacht Club uses the old part
Yes.
of the canal still today. It's the last part that is actually still used. So they splash the boats in there, and that turn that you have to make to the right, we got stuck because it is only 4 feet deep.
Yes.
We had to put it in reverse and back and forth.
Yacht Club is very good too. They let me take groups of people in there on bicycle tours and things like that. Yes.
If you hike to Block 19 currently, and that's the enlarged canal.
That's correct.
Where was the location of the original canal?
The Lock 32 was not very far from Lock 19. It was very close to where Lock 19 is.
The water, the path that goes through Block 19, was that also the path of the original canal?
It was next to it. Yeah. Because so what we have is when they enlarge the canal, for the most part they enlarge the original ditch. In some cases they took out some curves. They made it straight, and that's why in the Vischer Ferry Preserve we have the 1825 ditch actually laying practically next to the 1842 enlarged canal in a certain area, just west of Clute's Drydock. So you can see both ditches. But for the most part, they just enlarged the original ditch. Yes?
How often were the tolls collected?
Okay, so tolls were collected by waylock stations. Like in Syracuse, if you go to the Erie Canal Museum, that's one of the waylock stations. There was another one in Troy. And what they would do would be to weigh the boats. They knew how much the boats weighed, so then they would know how much the produce is. And that's where you would pay the toll. Yes.
Is it true it took about an hour for boats to go through a lock?
Sometimes longer if there was a waiting time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then in your presentation, you said on one day, 175 boats went through there?
It's 250, yeah.
So there must have been a lot of waiting.
Yes. And as I say, that's why you have the wide area as you come towards Drydock. Of course, they weren't all going through at the same time,
Yeah.
so. Any other questions? Well, thank you.
John.
Thank you.